So, I mean, I do think you have to present it in a certain way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, maybe at the introductory level, it's less about interpreting texts and more about just, okay, here's a question. Do people always make good choices or not? And then kind of encourage students to initially take sides, but then see how they're going to argue for that side and the ways in which the view could be attacked and kind of build more and more interesting views. I think that's just something everyone has an attraction to doing. I just think it's part of maybe human nature to have the capacity to do this and to view it as valuable and this is going to sound pompous, but engaging in that is an actualization of something that's valuable about you as a human.
Mm-hmm.
I've always found that to be extremely widespread. Mm-hmm. So even the students, occasionally you'll have the student who's like, yeah, but who cares, how will this make me money, that kind of thing. But even that student, when you actually get them to start tinkering with ideas and building their own arguments and thinking about really foundational questions, I think they all have a natural attraction to that. I'm Suzanne Obdrzalek. I'm in the philosophy department and I teach a range of courses. So I taught, does everyone know it's you, or can you interview me?
Oh,
my interviewer with me over here. I taught her in Intro to Philosophy. I think we call it philosophical questions. So I teach that every year, and I teach, my own specialty is in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. So I teach a variety of courses in that area. Maybe Intro to Philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Just because you're getting people, it's kind of like you get to do the conversion experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I would say usually 2/3 of the students in that class are only doing it for the GE and do not necessarily have a lot of confidence that philosophy is going to be relevant or interesting to them, and kind of seeing how I can convert them into thinking that philosophy is exciting and worthwhile and how I can really change how they think.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of students have never thought like a philosopher before, and getting to kind of witness the transformation is really fun. I don't know. I would say CMCers probably discount it because they think it has no practical relevance. I think there's also a tendency for people who haven't studied philosophy to assume that there's no boundaries for what are correct or incorrect claims to make within philosophy, so that it's just all people's opinions, and then that lends itself to seeing it as kind of a BS discipline. Sorry, that's not a very polished way to put it. So yeah, I do want them to recognize that it has relevance and value for them. And this is just how I see philosophy. There could be other methodologies, but as I see it, there are pretty robust constraints on what sorts of views you can advance, and that sets kind of, almost like chess, it sets parameters for then how you're going to play the game. Mm-hmm. So I feel like with teaching philosophy, I guess I suppose that philosophy is just intrinsically very, very interesting, and almost all people naturally have an inclination to enjoy it, and they've just never actually done it. Mm-hmm. So I think all you really need to do is set up an environment in which students can be kind of guided into doing philosophy themselves, rather than, teaching lectures where you're transferring information about what other people said, right? The goal is for them to just be philosophers and engage in philosophical discussions and build and test theories together. So I think of it as something very active. Mm-hmm. But when you try and create an environment where students can partake in philosophy, you have to kind of, in a way that's not quashing discourse, but you have to find a way to indicate what the boundaries are. So if someone, advances an argument that's invalid, you have to encourage the students to kind of, in a supportive way, critique one another so that they recognize that the argument's invalid, kind of like the chess analogy, so that they start to see that there are rules and boundaries to the game, which makes it valuable and interesting. And I think the more they do it, I think not only do students enjoy it, but they see the kind of progress they're making in their critical thinking, and then the practical transferability of that seems to me to be pretty evident. Well, sometimes that worries me a little bit. Mm-hmm. So I think, and maybe people are drawn to philosophy for different sorts of reasons, but I suppose for me it's a little bit of kind of that chess analogy. So what I find appealing about it is the methodology and the methodology, by that I mean the methodology of rational argumentation. And I think, there's a binary, like you're either advancing arguments that are valid or arguments that are invalid, but that doesn't seem to, shake my sense of personhood, because I suppose that if I discover that I've been arguing in an invalid way, I would want to stop arguing that way, so that's unproblematic. What I find a little troubling maybe is that to the extent that I'm attracted to philosophy just as discourse, I think the way I pursue it, and a lot of philosophers do tend to pursue it, is with a kind of detachment from the views, right? So I have my own views on certain topics, say abortion. I covered that in some of my intro classes. I have my own views, but if I'm going to teach abortion, whatever article I assign, it could be pro-abortion, it could be anti-abortion. I just want to figure out how the reasoning works, pick apart the reasoning, and attack every claim that could possibly be attacked, right? And there's a way in which when you're doing that, over time, I guess, maybe I'm a little bit of a skeptic, you start to realize that no matter what view you encounter, you have this skill set where you can kind of pick it apart. Which could make it seem as though it's all just a chess game and none of the actual views really matter. So, that would suggest that philosophy has a kind of irrelevance, right? That it's just about picking apart views and not about finding the right view, the one that you're going to really embrace, use to guide your life, that sort of thing. That's a tough one, because certainly, especially the ancient Greek philosophers whom I work on, they really valued that skill in argumentation, but they also really thought that being a philosopher is the most foundational thing you could do to ensure that you lead a happy life, and settling on the correct account of, say, what the human good is of enormous importance. It's not just intellectual chess, right? So how do you kind of have this attraction to the intellectual chess aspect while still really taking the views seriously as something to use to guide your life? I'm not sure. I think I tend to be a little bit more of an intellectual chess person. But I would think that if you take a view seriously, like say, I do have serious commitments on abortion. I would think part of taking the view seriously is wanting to be aware of the sorts of arguments you could advance for that view and what the feelings of those arguments are. Even if you recognize that you might be able to advance very compelling views on the opposite side and you're going to stick to your view no matter what, I still think that kind of commitment to testing the arguments is part of being serious about any view that you adhere to. So I think that certainly, well, let's start with the policy type of level. So should we as a society, provide reparations, make abortion legal, make abortion illegal, that sort of thing? If you want to answer any of these questions, right, you're essentially either advancing or thinking about arguments for those claims, and that's really what philosophy is training in. And I think, there's a real worry that if people don't learn to critically assess reasons for these claims, you're just going to have a bunch of yelling and no kind of careful intellectual assessment and progress on the issues. I think also if you have a broader construal of what you mean by public life, how do I want to live my life? What do I want my overriding goals to be? How do I want to treat other people? Those are all questions that philosophers have a lot to say on. So it doesn't just have to be, like the, abortion, animal rights, kind of super kind of narrow practical things, but just in a broader sense of what the practical is. One of the big topics in philosophy is just, what should be the purpose of your life. And I would think that's of enormous, I could imagine to some people it sounds like a waste of time, but it's really not, right? So it seems to have enormous practical importance. But for me, a lot of the attraction of philosophy also derives from a sense that it's just a fundamental human capacity, and hopefully even a human right, to be able to engage in abstract theoretical thought. And that side of philosophy where we study, do things exist? Are there things? Are things just bundles of properties? Just pick the most abstract question you can think of. I think it's very valuable for people to think about those things, and I think it would be tragic if they didn't. So I think philosophical training for many people is their first chance to engage in purely abstract and theoretical inquiry with no obvious practical application. It still relates, I suppose, to the last thing I said, which is I happen to think that part of the purpose of a human life is to engage in that sort of purely abstract inquiry. part of the appeal of philosophy is that we haven't really answered any of the questions, right? So you might think, I guess there are some areas where we would say, okay, a certain view is false and we've moved past that, but there aren't very many of them. And I think for me that when I was like your age, that was a part of the attraction of philosophy, was this feeling that, you know what, it's still a debate that you could contribute to thousands of years later. It had that kind of sense of openness, because these are questions that we just keep on kind of coming back to and debating and not settling. So with that in mind, I think a lot of the questions the ancient Greek philosophers are looking at are ones that we as philosophers are still debating with, and a lot of the ways, for certain of the views, their ways of developing the view or arguing for a position on it are still some of the best versions of that argument. So just if you're interested in, is free will compatible with moral responsibility, or do people always make rational choices, and you want to think about those issues, one of the best ways you could do it, I think, would be by reading philosophers like, Chrysippus or Plato, and just thinking through it with them and arguing with them. So I guess part of the appeal would be that I think they're just extremely good philosophers, and that's why, we've lost most of Greek literature, so the ones who've lasted are really some of the greatest thinkers in that tradition. There are other things I find appealing, though. One is that, say I work on Plato, but this would be true of a lot of the ancient philosophers, the great ones, that they're developing synoptic systems. So nowadays, especially given the economic forces driving academia, there's a tendency to be a specialist on a very, very narrow topic. And Plato, for example, wouldn't think that you could give an adequate explanation of, what are my political obligations to my fellow citizens, unless you also had an account of what's the fundamental structure of reality, what is knowledge, how do I get knowledge of reality, etc. All areas of philosophy he sees as interconnected. And I guess I just find it very intellectually attractive to think of philosophy in this more wide-ranging manner. There are a lot of things I like. A lot of them are fabulous writers. Like Plato is just a really good writer. I don't think that there's any, Descartes' pretty good too, but not as good as Plato. I don't think there are any writers in the history of philosophy who are as just beautiful writers as he is, so it's just a joy to spend time reading him. But the last thing, and it's something I alluded to earlier, is I think there was this real confidence in the relevance of philosophy to a good human life that, nowadays you don't see quite as much, but there were really high stakes. I think for Plato, for instance, he thought that you could not possibly lead a successful or fulfilling human life unless you had the correct metaphysical theory. So, it seemed to him that this wasn't just a purely intellectual exercise, a pure kind of chess game, but that it was something that was going to have the most fundamental importance to you leading a happy and successful life. So I like that kind of confidence about the really deep relevance of this. When I was an undergraduate, I knew I wanted to study philosophy from pretty much my freshman year, but I had no interest in or attraction to the history of philosophy, and then I kind of just happened upon it my junior year. And I definitely had that perception that the history of philosophy is not really philosophy, because it's just learning what other people said, and I thought philosophy is, coming up with my own philosophical theory. So, the misperception is the one you alluded to, which is that, I have been working on Plato, I don't know, for like 20 or 30 years or something. I still don't know what his views are, right? So it's very hard to come up, to really grapple with and figure out what they're saying on certain issues. And it's not just, Plato, I think, purposely actually maybe makes it a little hard to pin down his view, because he wants you to be an active participant, right? He wants you to kind of be grappling with what he's saying and hence doing philosophy for yourself. But it's not just that he expresses himself, through these dialogues, for instance, such that it's harder to pin down his view. It's also, I think, that the views themselves are very complex, so they're just open to a variety of interpretations. So I think it's just completely understandable that people would come into it with that misperception, also because a lot of the teaching students encountered, say in high school, very few people read the history of philosophy, but maybe they read other sorts of historical texts, maybe works by the founding fathers in America, or Shakespeare plays or whatever, but there's a way in which I think teaching to students at the high school level tends to be very passive, so they're just told by the teacher, here's what the view is, memorize it and spit it back on a piece of paper. And I think there's a tendency to assume that, oh, okay, any historical text is something I approach in that way. So what I try to do is just have the students read the texts for themselves and not tell them what it's saying, and have them try and figure out what it's saying, and it's awfully hard to figure out. But the cool upshot is, I think that when they try and pin down what the view is, often they find that just trying to figure out what the view is opens up philosophical questions that they hadn't considered previously. So, you know, here's just, I could think of so many examples, but here's one. Say, if you teach the Republic in the beginning by Plato, in the beginning of Republic 2, there's a way in which Glaucon frames this challenge for Socrates. And he says, look, there's 3 classes of goods. One class of goods you value for their own sake, one class of goods you value for their consequences, and one class of goods are valued for both. Which class do you think justice belongs to? Socrates answers it's the second class. Everyone then in the discussion agrees, okay, justice is valuable for its consequences. You don't go to jail. The whole project of the Republic is explaining why justice is valuable for its own sake. So there's a way in which you can teach that, and you make it seem that what the 3 classes of goods are is totally uncontroversial. And if you do that, of course, you're kind of, as I was indicating, like robbing students of the potential to see that these are actually completely controversial, right? So if they actually like pause and go through the examples that Plato gives, it becomes very hard to pin down how he's understanding what it is for a good to be an intrinsic good, right? He presents intrinsic goods, or people call it that, you wouldn't have used that phrase, but goods that are welcomed for their own sake. You know, the sorts of examples he gives are pleasures and things that produce pleasure, but that already might seem to be a little bit different, right? If something produces pleasure, then aren't you valuing it for the sake of some other good, the pleasure it produces? So how exactly do we distinguish between things we value for their own sakes and things we value for their consequences, right? Like, where do we draw the line between the thing itself and the consequences of that thing? Now, if you look at the kind of argument Plato gives in the Republic as to why justice is an intrinsic good, it's an odd sort of argument, right? He says it's an intrinsic good because it produces health of the soul, or because it produces pleasure, right? But that might sound like, oh, that should be a consequential good, right? Here's justice, and here are these other things, health of the soul or pleasure, that are offshoots from it. But he views that as showing us why we would welcome justice for its own sake, right? So this really pushes you to think about what the difference is between intrinsic and consequential goods. So I could go on about this, but the point is just that we take, initially coming into it, a certain kind of set of concepts or categories for granted, right? Intrinsic good, consequential good. But when you kind of poke at a view and try and figure out what the view is, you can see that those concepts aren't really obvious. And I think that opens different domains for philosophical investigation that students might not have thought of before. It might not have occurred to them that what is it for a good to be an intrinsic good is something that they could actually question and try and develop their own theory about. So it's like you're reading Plato, but as you're reading him and trying to understand him, you're also kind of doing philosophy for yourself, and also philosophy for yourself on topics or questions that you might not ever have thought to look into. Well, and also, I mean, another way in which this comes out is you're often looking at the origins, at least in the kind of Western tradition, of certain concepts. And so when you're seeing a concept kind of be invented, it makes you realize that this concept is, or maybe not invented, invented/discovered, depending on whether you're an objectivist or not about that. But when you kind of witness that moment in Western intellectual history, it makes you realize that the way we think of a certain concept is actually one that's very related to a certain socio-historical context. And when you look at the differences between how they carve out that concept and we do. So a really good example for that would be, a lot of students come into the course thinking like what matter is really uncontroversial. There's just, matter is this stuff, and science studies it, and matter is just like an objective thing, and you could say like how much matter is that, et cetera, et cetera. In the Western tradition, the word matter comes from Aristotle. There was no word for matter before him. And the word he uses, he didn't have a vocabulary to kind of refer to this. So he uses the word hule, which in Greek means wood, because he had to borrow a word that means something else and start using it for this other concept he wanted to talk about. But when you look at the examples Aristotle gives of matter, he's trying to explain, okay, what is matter? Here are some examples. It's not the kinds of things you'd expect. So the examples would include things like letters are the matter of a word. or premises are the matter of a conclusion. And that's very strange for students, because students would think that like premises and letters don't have spatial extension and don't have mass, so they can't possibly be matter, right? So it forces you to think about, okay, what conceptual role did Aristotle introduce this concept for, right? The conceptual role he introduced it for was matter as, I'm gonna get over, like, let me think about a simpler way to put it. He thinks of matter as what things are made out of and what persists kind of before something comes into being and continues to exist after that thing ceases to exist. So say a word, what's it made out of? Letters. What's the table made out of? Wood and metal. It's the same kind of form of explanation for him. And it's for explanatory purposes that he wants to introduce the concept of matter. And then of course there's an interesting story about how you get from there to our thinking of matter as defined in terms of things like what has mass or spatial extension. But it makes you realize that you can't just take for granted that like matter's this stuff and it's obvious what matter is.